Before we begin, just settle in for a little while. Let the room be quiet around you. Let your shoulders rest. There is nothing urgent here, only wood and iron and the slow work of hands. This is a story about barrels and about the people who made them before machines took over the work. A barrel is such an ordinary thing that it is easy not to think about it. We picture it in the corner of an old cellar, or lying on its side in a ship's hold, or stacked outside a tavern door, round, brown, banded with hoops, familiar enough to disappear into the background. But a barrel is a very clever object. It is a wooden vessel made without nails, without glue in the main body, and often without any straight pieces at all. It is built from narrow boards called staves, each one shaped so carefully that it leans against the next, edge to edge, until together they form a hollow cylinder. The sides curve outward in the middle, swelling gently like a held breath. The ends are closed with flat circular heads. Iron hoops press everything inward. The pressure of the hoops and the exactness of the wood make the vessel tight. That is the principle, simple to describe, not simple to make. Before machines, a cooper did not begin with a perfect board from a sawmill. He began with a tree, usually oak, because oak was strong, workable, and full of natural qualities that suited liquids especially well. The wood had to be split, not simply sawn, so that the grain ran properly along the length of each stave. A split stave followed the tree's own fibers. It was less likely to leak, less likely to break, less likely to warp in a troublesome way. Already, before the barrel had any shape at all, the cooper had to think in curves. Each stave would be narrower on the inside than on the outside. Each edge had to be angled slightly so that when all the staves came together they did not make a box but a circle. Each face had to be hollowed and rounded. Too much wood removed and the stave was weak. Too little and the barrel would not close tightly. There was no digital measurement, no factory jig doing the thinking. There was the cooper's eye, his hand, his tools, and the memory of many barrels made before. A good barrel seems almost natural when you look at it, like it has grown into that shape by itself, but every part of it is deliberate. The bulging middle makes it strong. It also makes it easier to roll. A heavy barrel full of wine, beer, flour, salt, fish, oil, vinegar, or water could be moved by one or two people because it did not have to be lifted all the way. It could be tipped onto its curved side and guided along the ground, slow and heavy but possible. That roundness mattered. In a world before plastic drums, steel tanks, cardboard boxes and shipping containers, the barrel was one of the great containers of everyday life. It held the things people drank, ate, traded, stored and carried over land and sea. And in the beginning, before we spend time with the cooper himself, with his axe and his shaving horse and the smell of fresh oak around him, it is worth pausing on why barrels mattered so much. Because a barrel can seem like a simple thing. It is only a wooden container, curved boards held together by hoops, a hollow space for storing something else. But for many centuries, before metal tanks, before plastic drums, before sealed cardboard boxes and machine-made crates, the barrel was one of the most useful objects in the world. It could hold liquids. That was the first great advantage. Wine, beer, cider, vinegar, oil, water, spirits and brine could all be kept inside a well-made barrel. If the cooper had fitted the staves closely and if the hoops had been driven down tightly enough, the barrel did not need glue or nails to keep from leaking. The pressure of the hoops squeezed the wood inward. The wood pressed against itself. The vessel became tight by shape and force. That was a quiet kind of cleverness. But barrels were not only for liquids. They held flour, salted fish, butter, nails, tobacco, dried fruit, gunpowder, salt pork, sugar, and many other things that had to travel or be stored. In markets, in ships' holds, in cellars, in breweries, in monasteries, in farmyards, the barrel was everywhere. Part of its usefulness came from its shape. A square chest has to be lifted, a sack has to be carried. But a barrel, even a heavy one, can be rolled. One person could move a weight that might otherwise need two or three. He could tip it slightly, set the curved side against the ground and guide it along with both hands.
Over a yard, down a ramp, across a quay, into a storeroom, the barrel moved in its own slow, obedient way. The bulging middle was not accidental, it gave strength, it allowed the staves to be bent into a form that resisted pressure, and it made the barrel easier to turn and roll because it touched the ground near the center rather than along a long flat edge. A barrel also packed well, rows of them could be stacked in a ship, wedged with blocks and rope, resting against one another in the dark. In a cellar they could lie on wooden racks, their heads facing outward, each one marked with chalk, paint, or a burned stamp. So the cooper was not making a decorative object, he was making part of the working system of daily life. A barrel could mean drink for a village, food for a winter, trade across a sea, wages for a brewer, or provisions for a ship leaving harbor. And all of this depended on wood, iron, water, fire, and skill. The barrel had to be strong but not too heavy, tight but not split, curved but not misshapen, large enough to be useful, small enough to be moved. It was an object balanced between many needs, and the cooper learned that balance through his hands.
Before a cooper could shape a barrel, before he could raise the staves or drive the hoops down with a mallet, he had to begin with the tree. Not every tree would do. Not every oak would do either. A barrel was only as good as the wood it was made from, and choosing that wood was one of the quiet, careful parts of the craft. Oak was preferred because it was strong, but not only because it was strong. Many woods are strong. Oak had a particular combination of virtues. It could be split cleanly along the grain. It had enough toughness to hold its shape under pressure. It could bend when heated and dampened, without simply snapping in two, and, when properly chosen, it could hold liquid with remarkable faithfulness. This mattered very much. A barrel for wine, beer, cider, oil, or water was not just a wooden container. It was a vessel made of many separate pieces fitted together without glue, often without nails, held tight by hoops and by the swelling of the wood itself. If the grain wandered too wildly, or if the wood had hidden cracks, or if the pores ran too freely from inside to outside, the barrel might weep. Not pour, perhaps, just weep. A slow, dark line on the stave, a damp patch on the floor, enough to make the cooper's work a failure. So the cooper or the timber merchant who supplied him looked for oak with patience. The tree should be mature but not decayed, straight grown if possible. Its trunk should offer long, clean sections without too many branches. Branches meant knots, and knots meant trouble. A knot might be beautiful in a board meant for furniture, but in a barrel stave it was a weak place, a place where the grain twisted and broke its even path. The best wood for staves was not simply sawn any way the sawyer pleased, it was often riven or split, following the natural line of the grain. This was important. When oak is split rather than sliced across its structure, the long fibers remain more continuous. The stave becomes stronger and more resistant to leaking. The cooper wanted wood that behaved like bundled threads running from end to end, not like threads cut open in many places. In many regions, coopers paid attention to the kind of oak as well. White oak, in places where it was available, was especially valued for liquid barrels because its pores were more naturally sealed. Other oaks could serve for dry goods, for flour, salt fish, nails, lime, or apples. A barrel meant to hold wine had different demands from a barrel meant to hold grain. The tree, in a sense, was chosen with the future contents already in mind. After felling, the oak still was not ready. Fresh wood was too wet, too lively, too likely to shrink and warp. It had to season. Staves might be stacked outdoors in neat piles with air moving between them, while rain washed some sharpness from the wood and time slowly drew out the excess moisture. Months passed, sometimes years. The cooper's work began long before the customer saw a barrel, and so at the beginning there was a quiet judgment in the forest or timber. Before a barrel could become a barrel, it began as something much rougher and quieter. It began as a length of oak cut from the trunk of a tree, heavy with sap and smell and weight. The cooper did not yet see a vessel in it, not fully. What he saw was direction, the way the grain ran, the way the wood wanted to divide. This mattered more than it might seem. A barrel stave was not simply a board, it had to hold liquid, it had to bend without breaking, It had to swell tightly against its neighbors and make a wall that water, beer, wine, or brine could not easily pass through. For that reason, the old cooper did not usually saw his staves from the log as a modern mill might. He split them. Splitting followed the grain, sawing cut across it. When oak is split by hand, the wood opens along its natural lines. The fibers remain long and mostly unbroken, running from one end of the stave to the other. This made the finished piece stronger and less likely to leak. A sawn board might look flatter, neater, more obedient, but inside it, the fibers could be cut short, leaving tiny paths where liquid might one day find its way out. So the cooper, or sometimes a specialist stave maker working in the woods, began with the log upright or laid across a block. He used a wedge, a wooden mallet, and sometimes a tool called a froe, a blade with a handle set at right angles used for riving wood apart. The first split might divide the round log in half, then each half became quarters, each quarter became smaller wedges. Slowly, patiently, the tree was opened like a loaf pulled apart by hand. There was a rhythm to it. Set the wedge, strike with the mallet, listen, watch the crack begin. If the split wandered, the worker adjusted, twisting the froe or setting another wedge to guide the opening back along the grain. The work was physical, but it was not only force. Too much force in the wrong place could waste good oak. A careless split could run off to the side and leave a piece too thin, too twisted, or too short for use. The best pieces came from straight-grained oak without too many knots. Knots were places where branches had once grown and the grain curled around them. They made beautiful patterns, but they were troublesome in a barrel. A knot could weaken a stave, resist bending, or become a point where leakage began. The cooper wanted wood that was plain in the best possible sense, steady, even, predictable. The split pieces were still far from finished. They were thick, wedge-shaped, rough along the edges with splinters and uneven faces. They did not yet look like the smooth curved staves of a barrel, but already the important decision had been made. The cooper had chosen to work with the tree's own structure rather than against it. In a quiet yard, with oak chips scattered around his feet and the damp smell of fresh wood. After the oak had been split, the cooper did not yet have a barrel stave. He had only a rough piece of wood, long and narrow, with the grain running honestly from end to end. It still had too much weight in it, too many corners, too much of the tree's original shape. The real work now was to persuade that piece of oak into becoming part of a circle. A barrel is not made from flat boards. That is one of the quiet difficulties of the craft. Each stave has to curve in two ways at once. It is wider in the middle than at the ends, so that the barrel can swell at its belly, and its edges are not square but slightly angled, so that one stave can lean against the next without leaving a gap. When all the pieces are brought together, those small angles become a complete round vessel. The cooper shaped each stave by eye, by hand, and by long habit. He set the rough split wood on a low bench, often a shaving horse, where it could be held firmly under pressure from his foot. Then he drew a sharp tool toward himself, again and again taking off thin curls of oak. The tool might be a drawknife with a handle at each end, or a cooper's axe for heavier trimming. Later, a plane could smooth what the knife had left. There was a rhythm to it. Pull, pause, look, turn the stave, pull again. The shavings fell in pale ribbons onto the floor, curling like dry leaves. The workshop smelled of fresh oak, a clean, slightly sharp smell, with something green still hiding in it. The wood was not being forced quickly, it was being read. The cooper had to keep the grain intact as much as he could. If he cut across it carelessly, the stave might weaken or split later when it was bent, or allow liquid to creep through some broken path in the fibers. Good barrel wood was valued because it followed its own length. The cooper's task was not to defeat that length, but to reveal the right shape inside it.
For barrels meant to hold liquid, the fit had to be especially careful. Wine, beer, cider, water, oil, all of them would find the smallest careless opening. So the stave's edge, called the joint, was worked with patience. A long jointer plane, sometimes fixed upside down on a stand, helped make the edge straight in one sense and angled in another. The cooper would pass the stave over it, test it against another stave, look toward the light and shave again. Nothing was perfectly measured in the modern way. There were gauges, patterns and rules of thumb, yes, but much of the judgment lived in the cooper's hands. He knew how a stave should feel when lifted, how thick it should be near the center, how the outside should remain a little proud because later the whole barrel would be dressed and smoothed. He knew that one piece of oak might behave differently from another, even from the same tree. Slowly the heap of rough split wood changed. One by one the staves became lighter, cleaner, more deliberate. They were still separate pieces lying side by side on the bench or stacked near the wall, but already, if you looked carefully, you could begin to imagine the barrel.
Before a barrel could truly become a barrel, the straight pieces of oak had to be persuaded into a curve. This was one of the quiet wonders of the cooper's work. A stave began as something stiff and stubborn. It had been split from the tree, shaped with axe and plane, narrowed toward the ends, hollowed slightly on the inside, and given a careful bevel along each edge. But it was still only a shaped board. It did not yet want to make a circle. Wood has memory. It remembers the tree. It remembers the direction of the grain, the slow growth of the rings, the pull of the fibers from root to branch. If a cooper tried to force the staves cold, they could split. A sharp crack would run through the oak, and all the labor already spent on that piece would be lost. So the cooper used heat, moisture, and patience. The half-made barrel was first set upright, open at one end with a few temporary hoops holding the staves loosely together. At this stage it looked a little like a wooden flower, narrow at the bottom and spreading wide at the top. The lower ends of the staves were already gathered into a circle. The upper ends leaned outward, waiting to be drawn in. Inside this open shell, the cooper might place a small fire, not a roaring fire, not a blaze that would burn the wood away, but a controlled fire, often made from shavings and scraps from the workshop floor. The same oak that had been cut from the staves could help bend them. The flame warmed the inside of the barrel, the heat softened the fibers. At the same time, the cooper sprinkled or poured water over the wood so that steam rose in the hollow space. Fire below, water above, and warm vapor passing into the grain. There was a smell to this work. Damp oak, smoke, hot wood, a faint sweetness from the sap and tannins. The workshop would fill with that slow, earthy scent while the cooper watched the staves and listened. Too much heat would scorch too deeply, too little heat and the wood would not bend. The skill was not only in knowing the rule, it was in noticing the moment. When the wood was ready, the cooper used a windlass, rope, or chain to draw the free ends inward. Slowly the staves came together. One by one they yielded to the pressure. The wide mouth narrowed, the open flower closed. The barrel began to take its familiar bulging shape, wider in the middle, tighter at the ends. This swelling curve was not decorative. It gave the barrel strength. It allowed the hoops to hold the staves under compression. It made the vessel easier to roll, easier to turn, easier to handle when full. The shape came from practical need, but it also came from fire, steam, and the careful bending of living material into a useful form. By the time the staves had been warmed, bent, and drawn into their first rounded shape, the barrel was still not really a barrel. It was more like a promise of one, a careful circle of wooden pieces leaning together, held by temporary hoops, waiting to be tightened into something strong. This was where iron entered the work. A cooper did not use iron because it was decorative. The hoops were there to grip the barrel, to hold the staves under pressure, and to keep them from spreading apart again. Each stave wanted, in its own quiet way, to return to the shape it had before the fire and steam softened it. Wood remembers. It swells and shrinks with weather. It pulls against restraint, so the hoop had to be firm enough to persuade every piece to stay where it had been placed.
Before machines, these hoops were made by a blacksmith or by a hoop maker from narrow bands of iron shaped into circles. They were not all the same size. A barrel is widest at the middle, at the bulge called the bilge, and narrower at the ends, so each hoop had its own place. The head hoops, near the ends, were smaller. The quarter hoops sat farther in. The bilge hoops, around the widest part, were the largest and strongest. The cooper knew them by eye and by touch. He lifted one, turned it slightly and set it around the waiting staves. Then came the wooden mallet. It was not a delicate sound, it was a heavy, dull, patient knocking, not sharp like a metal hammer on a nail, but rounder and lower, wood striking iron, iron pressing wood. The cooper worked his way around the barrel, tapping the hoop down a little at a time. If he drove one side too far, the hoop could twist. If he struck too hard, he might bruise the wood, or force the barrel out of true. So he moved in a circle, tap, turn, always listening. The mallet itself was usually broad-headed and well-worn, made to strike without cutting. In some shops the cooper also used a driver, a tool placed against the hoop so the blow landed more evenly. The force traveled through the tool into the iron and from the iron into every stave beneath it. As the hoops moved down, the barrel changed, gaps narrowed, the staves pressed shoulder to shoulder, the faint unevenness of separate pieces became one continuous curve. It was a slow tightening, not only of the object but of the idea behind it. A barrel worked because every part depended on every other part. No single stave could hold liquid, no hoop could hold anything by itself, but together, under pressure, they became useful. There was judgment in this work. The cooper had to know when the hoop was tight enough. Too loose and the barrel would leak or shift, too tight and the staves might be crushed or strained before the wood had settled. He was not measuring with a dial or reading from a gauge, he was reading the sound of the blow, the resistance in his arm, the way the hoop sat against the grain. In the dim workshop, with shavings on the floor and the smell of warm oak still rising from the wood, the sound of the mallet went on, slow, even, ordinary, a sound that meant
Raising a barrel was the moment when all the loose pieces began to look like a vessel. Before this, the cooper had been working with separate staves. Each one had been split from oak, trimmed, hollowed slightly on the inside, rounded on the outside, and narrowed toward both ends. They lay on the bench or stood in a rack like shaped pieces of firewood, each one a little different, each one chosen for the place it might take in the circle. Now they had to stand together. The cooper began with a raising hoop. This was not one of the final hoops that would stay on the barrel, but a working hoop, wide enough to gather the staves and hold them upright. He set it on the floor, or on a low block, and began placing the staves inside it one by one. The first few were awkward. They had nothing to lean against except each other. A cooper learned to hold them with his hands, his knee, the pressure of his body, and sometimes with a bit of string or a helper nearby. One stave was set in place, then another beside it, their edges touching, then another, and another, until the loose curve began to close. This was not a simple matter of making a circle. The edges of the staves had to meet cleanly, the grain had to run the right way. A stave that was too wide, too narrow, too twisted, or slightly wrong in its bevel would show itself immediately. It might leave a thin line of daylight, it might push its neighbor out of place, it might make the whole barrel lean. So the cooper watched closely. He did not force the barrel into shape all at once, he coaxed it. As the last staves went in, the circle became tighter, the wood pressed against itself, the raising hoop held the lower part together, while the upper ends of the staves flared outward like the ribs of an open basket. At this stage the half-made barrel looked strange and unfinished. It had a bottom circle but no belly yet. It was upright but not closed. It was a promise of a barrel rather than a barrel itself. Then came more hoops, driven down with a wooden mallet and a driver. The cooper tapped and turned, bringing the staves into better order. The sound was hollow and steady, wood against iron, iron against oak. Small corrections made again and again. The barrel had to be raised evenly. If one side moved too quickly, the shape would distort. If a hoop bit too hard in one place, it could bruise the wood or trap a stave wrongly. The cooper listened as much as he looked.
A tight hoop made a different note from a loose one. A stave under strain spoke through the tool. When the first end was secure, the barrel could be lifted, turned, heated, and drawn in at the open end, but that came slowly, for now the important thing was that the staves were no longer separate. They had begun to hold one another. A barrel was not made from one piece of wood, it was made from many pieces agreeing under pressure to become one shape.
Once the barrel had been raised, bent, and held in its hoops, it was still not quite a vessel. It was only the body of one. It could stand upright. It could show its familiar swelling shape. It could be rolled a little across the floor. But it could not yet hold wine, beer, flour, salt fish, or anything else worth keeping. For that, it needed its heads. The heads were the flat, circular ends of the barrel. They look simple when you see them from a distance, but fitting them was one of the careful parts of the cooper's work. A barrel head was not usually made from one wide board. Wide boards were expensive, and they could warp or split. Instead, the cooper made the head from several narrower pieces of oak, joined edge to edge. These pieces were called heading boards. He chose them with the same patience he gave to the staves. The grain had to be sound. The wood had to lie true. If the head shrank too much, or twisted even slightly, the barrel would leak at the end, where leaks were especially troublesome. So the boards were plain smooth, fitted close together, and sometimes held with small wooden dowels, so the round head would behave as one piece. Then came the marking. The cooper set his compasses or used a wooden template and scribed a circle onto the joined boards. The circle was not guessed. It had to match the inside of that particular barrel, because every handmade barrel was slightly different. Even when a cooper worked with familiar measures, the final shape still came from the wood, the fire, the bending, and the pressure of the hoops. The rough circle was cut out with a saw, then trimmed with a hatchet or drawknife, and finished more carefully with a plane. Around its edge, the head was thinned into a bevel. This bevel helped it slip into a narrow groove cut inside the ends of the staves. That groove was called the crows. The crows was made with a special tool, guided around the inside of the barrel near each end. It cut a clean channel into the staves, just deep enough to receive the head, too shallow and the head would not seat properly, too deep and the end of the barrel might be weakened. The cooper worked slowly, turning the barrel, checking the cut, listening to the faint scrape of the tool against oak. To fit the head, the hoops near one end were loosened slightly, the staves opened just enough to allow the wooden disc to be eased into place. It was a quiet, awkward moment. The head had to enter the crows all the way around, not sitting proud on one side or pinched on the other. The cooper tapped, shifted, lifted, and tapped again. When the head finally settled into its groove, the hoops were driven back down. The staves tightened around the edge of the head, gripping it firmly. No glue was needed. No nails held it fast. The strength came from shape, pressure, and the swelling nature of wood itself. And then the same careful work was done at the other end. Only after both heads were fitted did the barrel begin to seem complete. It had become a closed wooden room, small enough to roll, strong enough to travel, waiting now for water, for testing, and for the first. After the heads were fitted and the hoops had been driven down into their proper places, the barrel looked finished. It had its shape. It stood on its end like a small wooden tower. The staves curved neatly from head to middle and back again. The hoops held everything in a firm embrace. To someone passing by the workshop door, it might already have seemed complete, but a cooper knew better. A barrel was not truly a barrel until it could hold what it was meant to hold. Wine, beer, cider, oil, vinegar, water, salted fish, flour, nails, tobacco, or gunpowder. Each cargo had its own demands. Some needed the barrel to be almost perfectly tight. Others only needed it to be strong and dry. But for any vessel meant to carry liquid, the test was simple and unforgiving. If water could find a way out, then wine or beer would find it too. So the cooper tested. One common method was to pour a little water into the new cask and roll it gently across the floor. Not always a full barrel of water. That would be heavy, wasteful, and unnecessary. Sometimes only enough was used to wet the inside and settle against the seams. The cooper would turn the barrel slowly, letting the water reach the heads, the chime, and the long joints between the staves.
Then he watched. He looked for darkening lines on the outside of the wood. He looked for small bright beads forming under a hoop. He looked at the joint where the head met the groove, because that was a place where faults often showed themselves. A leak did not need to announce itself loudly. It might be no more than a shining spot the size of a pinhead appearing slowly in the grain. The workshop would grow quiet during this part. The hard striking of the mallet was finished for the moment. The fire had done its work. The barrel had been raised, bent, hooped and headed. Now the cooper waited for the wood to speak in its own slow way. If a leak appeared between two staves, it did not always mean the barrel had failed. Wood swells when wet. A small weep might close by itself after the staves absorbed moisture. This was one reason barrels were often soaked or rinsed before use. Dry oak could shrink slightly in storage. Wet oak tightened again. The cooper understood this, not as a theory written in a book, but as a habit learned through many barrels and many seasons. Still, some leaks needed help. A hoop might be driven a little farther down with the driver and mallet pressing the staves closer together. A rough place might be trimmed. A head might be reseated. In some cases, fine reeds, rushes or other packing could be worked into a stubborn joint. Later coopers used small tools and materials made for this purpose, but the idea was always the same: close the path the liquid had found. Then the barrel was tested again. There was patience in this work. A cooper could not argue with water. Water found every weakness, every uneven cut, every careless fit. It moved through the smallest gap without hurry, as if it had all the time in the world. And so the cooper had to be just as patient. He watched. He turned.
Wine asked something particular from a barrel. It was not enough for the vessel to be strong or watertight or easy to roll onto a cart. A wine barrel had to hold liquid for months, sometimes years, while changing it very slowly, almost without anyone seeing it happen. For this reason, coopers who made wine casks worked with special care. The wood mattered. Oak was the usual choice, not only because it was strong, but because it had a close grain and a gentle character of its own. When wine rested inside oak, the wood gave a little of itself to the liquid, not too much if the cooper had done his work well, just enough. A faint dryness, a warmer smell, a quiet deepening of the wine as it slept in the cellar. The inside of the barrel was especially important. After the staves had been raised and bent, and after the hoops had drawn the vessel tight, the cooper often toasted the inside over a small fire. This was not the same as burning it carelessly. It was controlled heat. The open barrel stood above the flame, and the inner faces of the staves slowly darkened. The fire softened the raw oak and changed its scent. A pale smell of fresh wood became something deeper, with hints of smoke, warm bread crust, spice and dry leaves. The cooper learned this by eye, by smell and by long habit. Too little heat, and the oak might taste sharp or green. Too much, and the barrel could mark the wine too strongly. There were no digital gauges, no factory settings, no identical production line. There was only the cooper standing near the fire, watching the color of the wood, turning the cask when needed, knowing when enough was enough. Wine barrels also had to breathe in a very small way, not leak, not fail, but breathe. Through the pores of the oak a tiny amount of air passed over time. Slowly, quietly the wine changed. Harsh edges softened, sediment settled. The liquid became clearer, rounder, more settled in itself. In a good cellar, the barrels lay on their sides in dim rows, their curved bodies resting in the cool darkness, each one holding a season, a field, a harvest, and the labor of many hands. The cooper's work was hidden inside all of this. A drinker might praise the vineyard, the year, the grape, or the weather, but beneath those things was the barrel, the hand-split stave, the trimmed edge, the hoop driven down with a mallet, the head fitted into its groove, the slow fire touching the inside of the oak. A wine barrel was not just a container, it was part of the making. It held the wine, but it also kept company with it, and in the quiet months underground, wood and liquid waited together, doing their slow work in the dark. Deer asked something slightly different from a barrel than wine did. Wine could rest for a long time, quietly changing in the dark, taking on a little of the oak, softening year by year. Beer was more restless. It was brewed, fermented, moved, tapped, and drunk in a shorter rhythm. It belonged to inns, alehouses, monasteries, farms, ships, market towns, and ordinary kitchens, and wherever beer went, the cooper's work went with it. A beer barrel had to be strong. It had to hold liquid, of course, but it also had to bear pressure. As beer finished fermenting, it could still give off gas inside the cask. Not enough to seem dramatic in the ordinary course of work, but enough to matter. A weak joint, a poor stave, or a badly fitted head could begin to weep. A hoop that was not driven down firmly enough could loosen. The cooper did not need theory for this. He knew it from the smell of sour beer on a cellar floor, from the sticky dark line appearing between two staves, from the publican's complaint when a cask had lost its freshness before it was sold. So barrels for beer were made with close attention to tightness. The staves were chosen and shaped so that their edges met cleanly along the whole length. The inside was made smooth, not polished like furniture, but clean enough that yeast and sediment could be washed away. The heads were fitted into the crows, the narrow groove cut near each end of the barrel, and the hoops were driven until the whole vessel held itself together with a quiet wooden tension. For beer, the inside of the cask was often treated carefully. In some places it might be scalded with hot water. In others it might be steamed, scrubbed, or rinsed with herbs, lime, or other cleansing mixtures depending on local habit. Cleanliness mattered. Beer spoiled easily. A sweet, sound cask could help keep it pleasant. A stale cask could ruin it. The cooper's work did not end when the barrel first left his shop. Beer casks came back again and again, stained darker with use, smelling faintly of malt, yeast, smoke, and cellar air. There were different sizes too, each with its own place in the old world of brewing. A small cask could be lifted and carried by one or two people. A larger barrel might be rolled across a yard, lowered into a cellar, or set behind the counter of an alehouse. The round shape made this possible. A heavy wooden vessel full of beer could be moved by turning it gently on its belly, guiding it with the hands, letting its curve do some of the labor. Imagine a brewer's yard in the cool part of the morning. The mash has been made, the air smells warm and grainy, empty casks stand in rows, their iron hoops dark with damp, their oak sides marked by old handling. A cooper or cellar man bends over one of them, checking the bung hole, tapping the hoops, listening for the small, honest sound of wood held tight. Not every barrel was made for wine or beer or anything that needed to improve with age. Many barrels were made for plainer work. They were made to carry food from one place to another, and to keep that food usable for as long as possible. Salt fish and flour were two of the most ordinary important things that passed through a cooper's hands. A barrel for salt fish had to be tight in a particular way. It was not just holding dry goods, it was holding fish packed in layers with coarse salt, sometimes with brine forming in the spaces between them. Herring, cod, mackerel, and other fish might be cleaned near the shore, packed quickly and sealed into casks before being sent inland or across the sea. The wood had to stand against moisture. The joints between the staves had to close firmly. The heads had to sit well in their grooves, because brine had a patient way of finding any weakness. The cooper did not need to make such a barrel beautiful. It did not need the careful inward sweetness expected of a wine cask, but it had to be honest. The staves had to be shaped so their edges met properly. The hoops had to bite down with enough force to hold the swelling wood in place. When the barrel was full, it would be heavy, damp, and rough to handle. It might be rolled across a quay, lifted into a wagon, or stacked in a storeroom that smelled of salt, rope, tar, and fish. Flour barrels asked for a different kind of care. Flour needed dryness more than anything. It was light, pale, and fine, and it spoiled if damp crept in. A flour barrel did not always need to be watertight in the same way as a barrel for liquid, but it needed to be close enough to keep out rain, dirt, insects, and mice as well as wood could manage. The inside had to be reasonably smooth so flour would not catch in splinters and corners. The heads had to fit securely, because flour could sift through surprisingly small openings. In a mill town, the cooper's work stood close to the miller's work.
Grain came in as sacks or carts of wheat, flour left in barrels marked by weight or owner, ready for bakers, households, ships, and markets. A good flour barrel was part of the quiet chain between field and table. It protected the work of threshing, grinding, bolting, and measuring. It made flour into something that could travel, so the cooper adjusted his craft to the contents. A barrel for fish was built to endure salt and wetness. A barrel for flour was built to guard dryness and cleanliness. One might smell sharply of the sea, the other might carry the soft dust of the mill. Both were simple wooden vessels made from staves, heads, hoops, and careful pressure, and both remind us that the old cooper was not making one object again and again exactly the same each time. He was making containers for the needs of daily life, listening to what each cargo required and shaping the wood accordingly.
The cooper's workshop was not usually a large place. It did not need to be. A cooper needed room for his timber, his tools, his hoops, and the unfinished barrels standing about in different stages of their making. Everything else was knowledge, habit, and the careful use of the body. If you stepped inside such a workshop before machines took over the trade, the first thing you might notice was the smell. Not one smell, but several, layered together. Fresh oak, sharp and green where a stave had just been cut. Older wood, dry and dusty. A faint scent of smoke from the little fire used for bending. Iron from the hoops and tools. Damp earth on boots. Maybe the sour trace of wine or beer from old casks brought in for repair. Along one wall there might be stacks of staves sorted by length and purpose. Some were meant for small firkins or kegs. Others were long enough for large tuns and vats. They were not smooth boards, not yet. They were narrow pieces of split timber, waiting to be shaped into the curved walls of a vessel. A cooper could look at them and see what they might become. The tools were simple but very particular. There was the side axe for rough shaping, the drawknife pulled toward the body, the jointer plane set long and low for making the edges meet cleanly. There was the crows used to cut the groove where the barrel head would sit. There were drivers and hammers for moving hoops down the swelling curve of the barrel. There were shaving benches, blocks, wedges, and measuring rods, all worn by use. Nothing in the workshop was quite straight, because the barrel itself was not straight. It bulged in the middle and narrowed toward the ends. Every stave had to lean, taper, and curve in relation to the others. The cooper was always thinking in roundness. A flat board could be measured with a square. A barrel had to be felt as much as measured. Light came through a door or small window, falling across shavings on the floor. The shavings were everywhere. Long curls from the drawknife, fine pale dust from the plane, chips knocked loose by the axe. They gathered under the bench and around the cooper's feet, softening the sound of movement. Apprentices learned here by watching first. They swept, they carried hoops, they held staves, they listened to the difference between a clean strike and a poor one. Slowly, over years, their hands learned how much pressure was enough. Too little and the joint would leak, too much and the wood might split. A cooper's workshop was a place of repeated actions. Lift, shave, turn, test, tap, tighten. The same gestures again and again until separate pieces of oak became something that could hold wine, beer, flour, fish, salt, or water. Outside, the world needed barrels constantly. Inside, in the quiet workshop, they began one shaving at a time. In the cooper's workshop, there was a sound that belonged to the trade more than almost any other. It was the sound of hoops being driven down over wood, not a sharp metallic clatter exactly, not like a blacksmith striking an anvil. The cooper's hammer was often a wooden mallet or a broad-faced driver used against the iron hoop, and the sound was lower, duller, more patient, a steady knocking, wood against iron, iron tightening around oak, blow after blow moving around the barrel in a slow circle. By the time the hoops were ready to be driven, the barrel already had its shape. The staves had been raised upright, held together loosely, bent inward by heat and moisture, and gathered into that familiar swelling curve. But at this stage it was still a delicate thing. It looked like a barrel, but it was not yet fully a barrel. The pieces were relying on one another, but they still needed pressure. They needed to be drawn together evenly all the way around. The hoop did that work.
A cooper would set the iron ring over the end of the cask, resting it loosely against the outside of the staves. Then he would begin tapping it downward, not all at once, not with wild force. The hoop had to descend evenly. If one side went too far ahead of the other, the pressure could twist the barrel, bruise the wood, or leave one stave sitting proud of its neighbors. So the cooper moved around it, tap here, step, tap there, step again. The hoop crept downward a little at a time. You can imagine the rhythm of it in a quiet shop, the scrape of the hoop as it shifted, the faint creak of oak under compression, the small adjustments of the cooper's feet on the floor, the breathing pause as he checked the line of the ring with his eye. Then the hammering began again. Each blow was simple, but the effect of many blows was precise. The hoop squeezed the staves together until their edges met tightly. A barrel did not usually rely on glue. Its strength came from shape, pressure, and careful fitting. The swelling curve of the staves pushed outward, the hoops pushed inward. Between those two forces the vessel held. There might be several hoops on a barrel, each with its own place and purpose, some near the ends holding the head securely, others around the belly keeping the middle tight. On larger casks the hoops were heavier and the work took more effort. On smaller barrels the sound might be lighter and quicker, but always there was that circular labor, that patient tightening. A good cooper listened as much as he looked. The sound of a hoop seating properly was part of the craft. Too loose, and the note was uncertain. Too harsh, and something might be binding badly. The workshop taught the ear over years. The hand learned how hard to strike. The eye learned when to stop. And when the hoop finally settled into place, the barrel seemed to become quieter. The staves no longer shifted. The form no longer felt temporary. It stood there with a new firmness, held together by pressure alone, ready for trimming, smoothing, testing, and use. The hammer was set down.
An old barrel was not simply thrown away when it began to fail. Wood had already been chosen, split, shaped, bent, dried, and bound. Iron had been forged into hoops. Time had already gone into it. And so when a barrel leaked or loosened or came back from a journey with one side bruised and swollen, it returned to the cooper if it could. The first part of repair was looking. The cooper set the barrel on its side, turned it slowly, and studied the staves. He looked for a dark line where liquid had seeped through. He looked for a cracked stave, a lifted hoop, a head that had shrunk away from its groove. Sometimes the trouble was obvious. A hoop had slipped down and the barrel had opened slightly at the bilge. Sometimes it was only a small stain or the faint smell of wine, beer, vinegar, or salt brine escaping where it should not. The barrel was held together by tension, the hoops pressed inward, the staves pressed against one another. The curved shape made the whole thing strong, but if the wood dried too much, it shrank. If it stayed wet too long, it softened. If it was rolled over stones, dropped from a cart, or stacked badly in a ship's hold, one part might shift just enough to make a leak. The cooper began by tightening. He used a driver and a mallet, tapping the hoops back toward their proper place. The sound was familiar in any cooperage. Not the loud ringing of a smithy, but a dull, steady knocking, iron against iron, wood answering beneath it. Tap by tap the hoop moved. The staves drew close again. Sometimes that was enough. If a stave was cracked, the repair was more patient. The cooper might remove one or more hoops, ease the damaged stave out, and fit another in its place. The replacement could not be any piece of wood. It had to match the curve, the taper, and the thickness of the old barrel. It had to sit neatly between its neighbors, neither too proud nor too sunken. A badly fitted repair would only make a new weakness beside the old one. The heads of barrels also needed attention. The flat circular ends were made from joined boards, trimmed to fit into a groove called the crows. If a head had warped, split, or shrunk, it might be taken out, tightened, patched, or replaced. The cooper cleaned the groove, checked the edge, and set the head back so it rested evenly all the way around. Then came testing. Water might be poured in, the barrel might be rolled and watched. A small leak could be sealed by swelling the wood, or by working a little reed, rush, or suitable packing into a seam depending on the trade and the contents the barrel was meant to hold.
Nothing was hurried. A barrel that seemed sound at first could reveal itself slowly. Repairing barrels was not glamorous work, it was maintenance. It was saving what could still serve. In a world where containers mattered and wood was valuable, a careful repair could give an old barrel another season, another voyage, another quiet place in a cellar or storeroom.
A barrel was not only a container, it was also a shape made for movement. This is easy to forget when we imagine it sitting still in a cellar, dark with wine, or lined up in a brewery, or standing near the wall of a storehouse with flour inside. But the cooper's work was meant to leave the workshop. A good barrel had to be carried, rolled, lifted, stacked, and shaken by roads, rivers, ships, carts, and hands. That is one reason the round shape mattered so much. A chest or a box had to be dragged or carried, a sack sagged and tore, a clay jar broke, but a barrel, if it was well made and not too heavy for its contents, could be tipped onto its bilge and rolled along the ground. The bilge was the widest part of the barrel, the gentle swelling around its middle. It gave the barrel strength, but it also gave it a kind of balance. A man could place both hands on the staves, lean his weight into it, and guide it forward, step by step. On a dockside, barrels moved almost like slow animals. They were rolled from warehouses to ships, from carts to cellars, from quays into storerooms. The sound was familiar in every trading town: wood turning over stone, iron hoops ringing softly when they struck a threshold, a short, dull thump as one barrel met another. The cooper had to imagine all of this before the barrel ever left his shop. The hoops could not be loose because travel would work them downward. The heads had to fit tightly because a small leak in the workshop could become a serious loss on a jolting road. The bunghole had to be sealed properly, sometimes with a wooden stopper and cloth or pitch, because the barrel might lie on its side for days. A wagon wheel striking a rut could shake every joint. River travel was often kinder than road travel. A flatboat loaded with barrels could drift downstream with far less jolting than a cart on frozen mud or summer ruts. In many places, barrels of beer, cider, wine, tar, fish, flour, and salted meat were moved first by river, then by sea, then by cart again. They passed through many hands. Someone rolled them up a plank, someone wedged them in place with chocks, someone covered them with canvas, someone checked the marks burned or painted onto the heads so the right goods went to the right town. Those marks mattered. A barrel might carry a merchant's initials, a measure, a place name, or the sign of the cooper who made it. In a world without printed labels on every package, the head of the barrel was a quiet piece of information. It told people what was inside, where it belonged, and sometimes whether the maker could be trusted. By the time a barrel arrived, it had already lived a little. Its staves had rubbed against rope, its hoops had struck stone, its wood had taken in the smell of the hold, the rain, the stable yard, the river air. And still, if the cooper had done his work well, it held together. When machines came into the cooper's trade, they did not change the purpose of a barrel. A barrel still had to hold something: wine, beer, flour, fish, oil, nails, tobacco, apples, water. It still had to be round. It still had to be tight. It still depended on the same old idea: many narrow pieces of wood shaped so carefully that together they made a vessel stronger than any one piece alone. But the way those pieces were made began to change. Before machines, each stave passed through the hands of the cooper again and again. It was split from the log, trimmed, backed, hollowed, jointed, and judged by eye. The curve was not drawn from a printed pattern so much as remembered in the body. The cooper knew how much wood to take away by the way the stave sat under the plane. He knew when an edge was nearly right by the thin shaving that curled from it, and by the small change in sound as the tool moved along the grain. Machines did not remove all of that knowledge at once. At first they took over the heaviest and most repetitive parts. Saws cut boards faster than a man could split and hew them. Planing machines made long surfaces smooth in a steady motion. Later, special machines could hollow the inside of a stave and round the outside, giving it the familiar swelling shape needed for a cask.
Other machines cut the crows, the groove near each end where the barrel head would sit. This saved time, it saved backs and shoulders, it made it possible to produce barrels in much greater numbers with more regular parts. A barrel factory could turn out casks for breweries, railroads, distilleries and food merchants at a pace no small workshop could match. The rows of staves became more alike, the hoops came from rolling mills, the heads were cut in circles with less waste and less hesitation, and yet even then, the barrel was not an entirely simple object. Wood still had its own opinions. One stave might spring too much, another might twist. Oak from one tree might bend kindly over heat and steam, while oak from another resisted, cracked or opened a hidden flaw. The machine could shape the part, but someone still had to notice whether the part belonged in a good barrel. So the cooper did not vanish immediately, his work shifted. In some places he became less of a maker from beginning to end, and more of a fitter, inspector, repairer and finisher. He watched the staves come through, he raised the barrel from prepared parts, he tightened the hoops, he tested the seams, he listened for leaks, he corrected what regular machinery could not quite understand. Something was gained, barrels became cheaper, more plentiful and more standardized. Trade moved more easily when containers could be made quickly and in predictable sizes. A brewer could order many casks, a shipper could count on supply, a warehouse could stack goods in vessels that looked more and more alike. Something was also softened out of the work, the small irregularities of hand shaping became less common. The cooper's bench with its
There is a kind of quiet that settles over an old workshop when the day is finished. The fire has burned low, the shavings have stopped falling, the mallets are resting on the bench, their handles darkened by years of use. In the corner, where the light from the doorway no longer quite reaches, there is a barrel. It may not be a perfect barrel, its staves are not all the same color. One is a little paler than the others, cut from a different part of the tree. The hoops have been driven down by hand, and if you look closely you can see small marks where the hammer struck the iron. The head is fitted tight, but not with the blank precision of a machine. It has the look of something persuaded into shape, something that was argued with gently over many hours until it agreed to hold together. By now we have followed the barrel from the forest to the workshop. We have seen the oak chosen, split along the grain and trimmed into long curved staves. We have watched those staves warmed by fire and drawn inward by hoops, until the open bundle of wood became a vessel. We have seen the crows cut near the ends, the heads fitted into their grooves, the hoops tightened, the leaks found and stopped. None of it was mysterious exactly, but none of it was careless either. A good barrel was not made by force alone, it was made by judgment. The cooper had to know how wood moved. He had to hear the difference between a hoop that was seated properly and one that was still riding high. He had to feel, through his hands and wrists, whether a stave was bending or beginning to split. He worked with tools that were simple in appearance: axe, drawknife, plane, adze, compass, driver, mallet. But in the hands of someone practiced, those tools made something strong enough to travel across oceans. Before machines changed the trade, barrels were everywhere, in cellars, on wagons, in breweries, in ships' holds, in markets, beside kitchen doors, under warehouse beams. They carried wine, beer, oil, flour, saltfish, nails, apples, gunpowder, water, and hundreds of other ordinary things. They were so useful that people stopped noticing them. They became part of the background of work, trade, hunger, storage, and travel, and that is often the fate of useful things. They disappear into use. Nobody thanks the barrel for keeping the rain out of the flour. Nobody pauses over the hoop that held through a winter crossing. Nobody remembers the cooper who shaved one stave a little thinner because he knew it needed to bend more than the rest. But the barrel in the corner remembers in its own way. It remembers the tree. It remembers the wedge, the knife, the smoke, the iron, the pressure of the hoop, and the last slow tap of the mallet. It stands there after the workshop has gone quiet, round and plain and patient, and perhaps that is enough. A barrel was never meant to call attention to itself. It was meant to hold, to carry, to wait in the dark, doing its small necessary work. Like so many handmade things,